Well, thanks everyone. We are so glad to have you here today. We have two great folks with us who I'm super excited to hear talk a little bit about new schools and how they're thinking about, the addition of new charters in the space, especially during this kind of, even though I'm sure we're all tired of hearing the phrase unprecedented times, but during these unprecedented times. And I thought I would just take a really quick second to just talk a little bit about our series more broadly. So I think most of you know that we have a series called Uncharted Waters. And for each month during of Uncharted Waters, we have a different theme and we explore that theme in different ways. This month's theme is new schools. And so again, really thinking about what does it mean to an authorizer to open new schools, to open either brand new startups or replicated, expanded schools during this time, because obviously it looks very different and the data we have is different. And, just again, the time period is different. So that certainly impacts families and students and enrollment numbers, et cetera. So we have Aasimah Navlakhi with us today. She is the CEO of BES, and she's going to be talking a little bit about BES and how they have seen new schools open up over this last year and looking to the future. And we also have with us Sonda Howell, who's a partner over at the Charter School Growth Fund. And she's going to talk about the same thing, but a little bit from the funder's perspective. So without further ado, let me just kind of go over the run of show today. So the way this is going to work when we have an expert roundtable, sometimes we do it a little bit differently. But today, the way it's going to work is we are going to first hear from Sonda. She's going to talk a little bit about, again, CSGS and what they're seeing in terms of new school openings and just thinking about that from the funder's perspective, but also giving some advice to you all as authorizers. Then we will hear from Aasimah, who will do the same, but again, a little bit more from that incubator side and working directly with school leaders. And then I'll ask a few questions just to prime the pump, get us rolling, and then we'll open it up to a larger Q&A. And then we'll close out. So we have about an hour and 20 minutes available, although in the past we haven't always used up that entire time. So if we can give you some time back today, we will certainly do that. But without further ado, let's have Sonda Howell start us off. And Delphino, if you can put up the PowerPoint, we should be good to go.
Thank you, Veronica. So as Veronica shared, I am Sonda Howell with Charter School Growth Fund, and I lead the seed strategy. And so any of our investments in early stage, so founders or smaller charter networks. I am excited to chat with you all today. And for my time, I wanted to answer three main questions. One, what is CSGF's seed strategy? What is that all about? Two, what was the impact of the pandemic on new school openings? And then three, based on the work that we do with early stage networks and networks led by leaders of color and community-based leaders, what would I like you to know as authorizers? And of course, the Q&A, we can dig more into these questions or other questions. So Delphino, can you advance the slide? So just a quick overview. I'm sure many of you are aware, Charter School Growth Fund was founded in 2005 to invest in high-performing charter schools to increase their impact. And prior to 2014, we really only focused on large-scale growth. And so if a high-performing school network wanted to add 1,000+ seats, we were interested in considering them. Delphino, can you advance the slide? But now we we are focusing also on early stage work. And so our seed strategy began with the launch of the Emerging CMO Fund, which was really focused on supporting leaders of color. With our prior strategy, when it was only large scale growth, our national portfolio was not reflecting the background, racial and ethnic background of the communities that our networks were serving. And the reality was that there were many more high-performing charter schools led by leaders of color. And so the question was, why weren't we supporting them? And it was either because they didn't have ambitions to grow, or their ambitions weren't large-scale growth. And it was clearly the latter, which meant that because of our process, they didn't qualify. And so essentially we were closing the door on a set of entrepreneurs who were having tremendous impact on their communities. So our Emerging CMO Fund was the way to open up that door. So we launched the Emerging CMO Fund, which was designed to increase the number of high-performing networks led by leaders of color. And so the fund was targeted for anyone who was leading a network of 1 to 2 schools and was interested in adding their one or next few schools. And if you see by this slide, the fund has grown over the years because there are many leaders of color who are interested in growing. We were at 9 at the end of the first fund, 40, and now we have 62 active portfolio members. And we will probably grow to a sweet spot of 75, if not more, over the next few years. And as you can also see from the chart, what we decided to do was to couple any early stage investment that the organization was doing, because while the Emerging CMO Fund was focused on leaders of color, we also had some early stage investing in innovative models. We collapsed and coupled all of the early stage investment under one umbrella, and we call it SEED. And so we've always been model agnostic. And under the SEED umbrella, we will still prioritize leaders of color of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, but we would prioritize leaders of color. Our current portfolio is about 80% leaders of color right now. Okay. Delphina, you can advance the slide. And so under our strategy, we have 2 ways for leaders to receive funding. One is for their next school, and then also for founders launching their first school. And so if anyone is growing between 250 seats to 1,200, we are interested in under the SEED umbrella. If they want to add more than that, past that, great, but to qualify for a funding, you don't have to have further ambitions to grow past the 1 to 2 schools. So that's a little bit of background on the SEED strategy. Delphino, you can stop sharing the slides because I have no others after that. In terms of the impact of the pandemic, we can transition to there since I gave you the background of where we are. What we ended up seeing was that for schools that were slated to open in 2020, we saw little to no impact on school openings. This past fall, we expected 79 school openings across our entire portfolio, and only 2 delayed. And so we saw 77 new schools open, so north of 95%. To me, this definitely speaks to the resolve of entrepreneurs that opened. We're still motivated to serve students and families in the wake of all that occurred last year and all that has been occurring to really step up. However, for leaders that were considering or are still considering opening in 2021 is where we did see the impact. So for existing schools that were interested in continued expansion or replication, for our current portfolio during calls throughout the year, as time went on, there was a lot more uncertainty about under what condition the school would open, and would it be hybrid, remote, and if they wanted to go that route. And there was also a lot of uncertainty around what authorizers would do and what they would be looking for to approve a replication. And so between the uncertainty of all of those factors, a number decided that they were going to push it back. So we have more schools that are planning now to open in 2022 than in the fall 21 than we had originally anticipated from last year. For first school launches, we saw a record number of applications from founders. This grew about 54% from 2020. And some of them have charters in hand and some of them don't. But again, it signaled to us that there is such an appetite to respond to this call of action to do more from entrepreneurs all over the country. And so based on what has happened in the past year and our work with early stage organizations and leaders of color and community-based leaders, I would want you all to know and consider like 3 key things. One would be to continue to make your processes and policies transparent. Continue to be clear and even more clear about how you'll be evaluating the 1920, 2021 school year, and making sure that it's as clear to leaders who are interested and that it is as fair as can be given the conditions schools had to operate under during those years. There's a lot of questions around whether there will be an opportunity for charter renewals, replication approvals from our current leaders, and I can only imagine that there's questions out there for others as well. And then the other would be just transparency at every step for new applicants. For leaders who come to us who don't have charter approvals, we will sometimes make an investment, but we always ask how clear is that path to charter approval? And for more of our community-based leaders who may not have expertise in creating a charter application or have resources, the charter application process is intimidating. And my advice would be that it shouldn't be that they get to the first stage gate and find out it's a no. If possible, it would be incredibly helpful to have essentially checkpoints along the way so that they could also assess how they're moving and tracking, and if they can get feedback. And so if that means providing example of successful applications online or offering office hours so that they can ask questions, and making it seem as though you're more open to hearing where they may have doubts or questions or certainty about something. That's one. So making processes and policies transparent. 2 would be make it easy for high performing charters. For those with existing track records, my big question is, what are you doing to encourage the best performers to serve more students if they want to grow and if they have outsized demand? The leaders was a lot on leaders' plate this past year. It was interesting to hear high-performing schools spend a lot of time worrying about what their renewal process was going to be in the middle of the pandemic. It should, of course, be rigorous and challenging, but they shouldn't necessarily have as much doubt as they voiced in terms of whether or not they will be able to meet the demand of families that were sitting on the wait list. Of course, it should be rigorous, but I think it's just balancing how it's differentiated for those who are higher performing, for those who don't have results. And then I would say the other is just making sure that the barriers and hurdles for that gets out of their way so that they can expand their impact and move quickly. Then the third headline would be, build an ecosystem of diverse options for families. Based on what we saw with the spike in the applications, there were a lot of more diverse models than we have seen in the past. Models that really wanted to focus on student populations that were more underserved, homeless, adjudicated, LGBTQ plus focused, overage, undercredited, more so than we have in the past. And I know that sometimes we could think that authorizers' job is just to evaluate what comes to the door. But I would posit that authorizers should also be thinking about how to build an ecosystem of diverse models and options so that families can choose from. And so what role are you playing to make sure that diverse schools are applying for charters? Diverse options probably means diverse leaders, and having leaders that are very familiar on how to build a charter application may not happen. And so similar to the transparency of processes, I would say this is also connected. How are you directing resources that allow them to build high quality applications? Sometimes our leaders come to us and they're really excited for funding, and then we ask them for their charter and how that's going. You know, we are also spending time saying, oh, you should connect with this consultant, or here's an incubator that you could consider. But I would say if we are doing it and authorizers are doing it, we can essentially just raise the quality of the pool of applications from diverse leaders. And then I would say we can't really get to a diverse ecosystem without reflection of current state. And so my question would be, how are you all continuing to think about equity? What does your portfolio look like? What schools are approved? Which schools aren't approved? And what does equity look like at each process? And where are things breaking down? Where is there demand and not enough supply? And what is your role in addressing that? Yeah. So I'll leave you with those questions. I'll step back and turn it back to Veronica and look forward to hearing what questions you all have.
Awesome. Thank you, Sonda. I really appreciate that. I've been taking notes, and I have some questions for sure. So I'm sure a lot of the folks in the audience do too. But before, again, we move on to the questions, I'd love to bring in the voice of Aasimah from BES and hear her speak a little bit about this, but from the incubation side. So Aasimah, take it away.
Thanks, Veronica. Thank you all for making the time and for including me in this session. It's really lovely to see all of you and to have this opportunity to really share what we have seen over the years as an incubation organization and how we're shifting to really support leaders at all stages of growth, and then to really share some of our thoughts with you all, given that we have the opportunity to do so on behalf of our leaders in terms of authorization. So I'd love to just share, Delphina, if you can move forward, a little bit about BES, since we have rebranded from Building Excellent Schools to Build, Excel, Sustain, and share our theory of change, which is to identify diverse groups of committed, high capacity leaders, supporting them to craft, communicate, and implement a new vision so that they are equipped to build and sustain high quality schools in direct response to the needs of communities for students that have been traditionally underserved. Something that is true across the BES portfolio is that over 90% of students in the schools founded by our leaders identify as students of color. And we know that racism is American and that the status quo is not serving those students well. And so our theory of change is that if we identify, Sonda, to your point, diverse leaders that can really create an ecosystem of schools that cater to the choice that families want and deserve, we will be able to raise the bar for the quality of education across the country. Our role in that is to identify and open the door to those leaders who have not traditionally been able to have the support or the skill sets to bring their vision to life, and help them through our process to create that charter application, to really distill that vision, and really respond to the needs of a community. Our shift also is a shift away from the traditional no excuses model that we know has been oppressive to students of color for generations, and our responsibility to actually change that and bring leaders to the forefront who are willing to step up and create truly anti-racist spaces for kids. This year, we launched our first community co-design fellowship towards that effort, which is a fellowship that includes voices of community in the design process for the school. So having a leader take on this work with voices of parents and community leaders, et cetera, actually going into the design of the school so that we are being responsive to the local community. And that takes time, that takes effort, and that takes really a longer runway than what we've seen in the past. And so to really talk about or underline the effects of the pandemic that Sonda, you had shared, we've seen something similar, which is schools that are planning to open in 2021 and fellows that are coming in now. Our conversation really is, you might be looking at a 2-year timeline before you actually even get authorized. And that's one of the challenges in an already drawn out process with the impacts of the pandemic this year. But again, one of the positives on that side is additional time for true authentic community engagement that is really required minimally to be able to create a school that is responsive. Delfino, you can move the slide forward. So I'm just going to go get straight to it because we have a lot of thoughts around how we can support our leaders navigate the authorization process with you all, and would love to offer some of our suggestions to this group. So the first is really redefining community engagement and how leaders demonstrate need and demand that isn't tied to snapshot methods that don't fully capture the evolving nature of capturing community perspective. So I think electronic signatures, really thinking about protecting family choice and being inclusive where families may not feel comfortable putting their names down on a piece of paper, and how we can really think about equity from that point of view when we're thinking about community need. The second, and this is again, speaks directly to what you were saying, Sonda, is just transparency in the process, in rubrics, in scoring. What does success look like? What makes an applicant group a good fit? Not necessarily just the best application, but also the best application that is meeting a demand in the community and is the right fit for that community that could get to approval. The ability for leaders to get feedback early on in the process, again, so they can make modifications as needed and improve and come back stronger. The third, I think, is something that is has come up pretty often in our work with our leaders around their review process. So BES, we ourselves are doing a lot of work around DEI for our team, and realize very quickly that yes, that work starts at a personal level, but also needs to address system structures, policies that we have as an organization towards our selection processes, towards our coaching, towards our reviews. And all of that work that we're doing on the incubator end needs to, in parallel, be happening on the authorization front with funders for the change to actually happen in the ecosystem. So we would encourage you all to really think about how do we face biases that reviewers may have? How do we think about representation in school leadership and on reviewer boards? How do we think about, what leaders get pigeonholed into culture roles, for example, and how do we actually build development pathways for leaders of color to really be thinking about school leadership overall? How do we think about inequities and access to funding? It's so wonderful to see the growth fund shifting in many ways to really think about opening up those gates of access that have not been so accessible before to leaders of color. An example this year comes out of Georgia. The authorization cycle was pushed back for a year. We had 3 fellows in a cohort, 2 leaders of color, all who had to now find a way to sustain for a year. And these are real lives and jobs and real leaders with families and responsibilities. So how do we think about ensuring that when we do have impacts such as the pandemic, which we know is going to happen again at some point, how do we set up leaders to be successful and continue to keep them engaged in the work of eventually opening that school, because we do lose really strong talent when things like this happen. Another example, and we've seen this from feedback our leaders have received on models they've proposed, comments like, how will this model work with these types of children? Or this is meant for WASPy children. Like, these are actual comments we get back. So how are authorizers, how are you all thinking about reviewing the reviewers, and at what point in the process, or is there a point in the process where it might make sense to pull a reviewer from a process, or think about how that would impact who's getting approved and who isn't. my penultimate point is diversifying boards, again, going to, representation, of course, authorizer boards and bringing different perspectives in. And then also with the impacts of the pandemic, thinking about things that may have been deal breakers before. So gaps in resumes that we have seen that always becomes a red flag. How do we actually think about that differently, given that the pandemic has potentially created those for leaders and inequitably created those for leaders of color at a larger rate? And then the last piece, again, has been mentioned by Sanda already, is promoting diverse models and really thinking about what are the types of school models that are meeting needs that are explicit in communities and that will build an ecosystem that is more inclusive and create opportunities for parents and families that are looking for something different. So encouraging diverse school models in authorizer portfolios, and thinking about, again, that balance between, yes, replicating high performing schools, but also not closing the door to newer single site schools who might have a different approach or a different population that they want to serve, that could potentially grow into networks down the line. So those are all of our thoughts. That was a lot, so I will pause there. And Delfino, I'm actually not sure if I have another slide or not, so maybe you could try. There we go. That's just my name and my information, so we can get there later. But I'll pause, hand it back to Veronica, and I'm excited to get into the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So like I said, I've got a couple of questions to prime the pump, but then I would love to open it up to the audience. So I'll just go ahead and start. Sanda, I'll start with you. So, you mentioned how when it comes to growth for the 2020 school year, didn't seem like there was much of a change. For 2021, there does seem to be more uncertainty. But I think what was most interesting and surprising to me was actually about this huge explosion in the number of folks who fall actually into the startup category, right? The new founders. And you talked a lot about you talked some about how a lot of those folks are people of color. And it made me wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of the why, because this is a really uncertain time. So I don't think anyone would blame folks for being like, nope, not interested in starting a school right now. But it's also a time where I think, at least more in my lifetime than I've ever seen, that we're having more open conversations and dialogues about race and inequity and issues of injustice. And so I'm wondering if you think that has anything to do with that growth, or if there's something else driving it.
No, I mean, I think you're exactly right, Veronica. A lot of the applications, if not all, mentioned, specific incidences that have happened in the past year and how they have been more driven. And this is a way of driving towards justice and being a part of a social justice movement. And so I think, sometimes in the midst of pain, like, people can really come through and have a level of hope and see the light. And for a lot of the applications, it's really like, this is my way to shed some light and to do better and prepare the next generation for an even better environment, community, conditioned world, all of that. So I would say that definitely is a key driver to the uptick in applications.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And that kind of brings me to my question for you, Aasimah. I think one of the things that I heard you say that I found really interesting was this co-design fellowship. And I'm sorry if I got the name wrong, please correct me. But this idea of having, going beyond community engagement, right? This is actually working with communities to build something for communities by the community, it sounds like. But I would just be interested to hear a little bit more about how that fellowship works And then also, if you has anyone been authorized yet from that group?
Good questions. So we piloted this last year. So Josh, who's our co-design fellow, is now going into his second year of the fellowship. So there haven't been any authorizations through it, but we're working on it in Atlanta. And the process basically is our traditional fellowship is 1 year. A leader comes in, they sort of own the mission and vision of the school. They go through the fellowship and do school visits and really understand effective practices and engage with the community, but iterate on and participate in the fellowship individually as the leader and write that application as the leader with their board. How this looks different is that the fellow comes in that first year, builds a team of community members that actually participate, quote unquote, in the fellowship together, and really own that mission and vision and creation of the school design plan together before that becomes the charter application and goes in. And not all of those community members would become founding board members, but some of them might. So it's a longer process. It allows for almost a year in addition to the year-long fellowship. It's a 2-year process, and that all of that community engagement is front-loaded. So the type of leader that we're looking for that process is a little bit different. It is someone who has a basic idea of the type of school they're looking to envision, but is open to really building on that with input from community versus a leader who comes in or is from a community and specifically understands a mission and vision that they want to bring to fruition.
Got it, thank you. I have a ton more questions that I could ask, but I am always wary of talking too much because that is my nature. So I would love to just open it up and see if folks on the call have questions, thoughts, anything that you heard that was intriguing and you want to know more about. And I think we have a fairly small group, so if you just want to take yourself off mute, I think that'll work. Crystal, I saw that you raised your hand. Do you want to go?
Sure, that would be great. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm actually going to be joining you all next week to talk about some updates to our process potentially. And so, Swenda, I was really interested in what you were saying around how the application process can be revised in such a way that's giving more feedback, kind of more steps in the process, those kinds of things. Could you just expand on that a little bit and maybe talk about where you're seeing that done well, or other suggestions, kind of tips or tricks that you have?
Great question. I could not tell you where exactly it's being done well because we are national focused. And so it just depends on the conversation. I haven't necessarily tracked. But I think the hardest is when we talk to a leader and they just know that they completed the application and it doesn't move forward. It gets not approved. And so when they're trying to figure out how to revise and improve, they're not clear about the next steps or like where to go with that. And so that's part of like the transparency and the suggestion for the checkpoints essentially, or even having successful applications online. And I would push to have successful applications of diverse models because they would all look different so that they are not saying like, oh, it has to have this in order for it to be approved. Would just be helpful for someone who just sees the whole process as intimidating, who where their vision is strong, compelling, but what they have is not necessarily packaged in what you're evaluating. They just need to know what like the rules of the road are. And so in any way that you can do that, I can't remember where this leader was, but nope, I don't want to even guess where it was. Someone said they received feedback on their application from someone from the Authorizers office on where they could improve. It was like a one-on-one. I don't know if it was offered broadly or this person just had a connection. And it really helped them to just, one, feel more confident about their application and then also know exactly where to improve. And so I think in any way that you can make the process just clear, and of course, if there isn't a clear plan, like, no amount of feedback necessarily will get them there. But if it's just like one or two things or key areas that they could spend more time providing more detail or expanding on, it would be great to have that not be the reason why a great opportunity for kids and families to not happen.
Thank you. Shanita, I see your hand is raised. Do you want to go?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sawinda. Thank you, NACSA and Aasimah, for presenting this information. I'm very excited that you both are in front of authorizers. So in addition to, having the question about or having the conversations about more diverse leaders and communities, I feel like conversations with authorizers and the Growth Fund and, incubators like BES and leadership organizations are needed. So I would just like to add two points to give a plug for BES. Aasimah mentioned the leadership development. I think that as authorizers are starting to lean into providing technical support or offering opportunities for schools to develop capacity, organizations like BES are great resources to either share, or as many authorizers are creating their own support entities or capacity development opportunities within their office. BES is a great sort of organization to look to and lean in for that as well. And then on Sawinda's point about the application, and your question, Crystal, some authorizers Chicago was really great for this. I can say they had different milestones or benchmarks in their process. So you had to get through process point A before you could move on to process point B. And if you didn't make it, you were invited to come back another round, and the authorizer, the office, would have a conversation and in some cases provide written feedback to that applicant. So that's a way to kind of think about, addressing that.
Thanks, Shanita. Well, I have another question that no one else does at the moment, so I'll go ahead and ask mine. So Aasimah, I think one of the things that you mentioned was, in terms of your advice to authorizers, was about redefining community engagement. I'm very interested in this because actually my team, so Jason Zara, who's on the call as well, we have just looked through state laws to understand the different ways that statutes require authorizers to engage in community engagement, quote unquote. And we're going to be putting out a paper hopefully in June-ish. Definitely emphasis on the ish, to figure out or to talk a little bit about like some of the interviews and what we heard from authorizers about, here's what's in statute, but then here's what that looks like in practice. And there's usually there's a lot of variance in how authorizers are doing this work of community engagement. So my question, I think, is what are some ideas that you have for what it could look like for an authorizer to do community engagement that isn't just kind of what the bare minimum is in the law?
Great question. And I would love to, I can share a couple of ideas and would love to actually hear from the group because I'm sure there are more and others. But I think two pieces come to mind. One goes back to the snapshot. So for some authorizers, we know that there's an application deadline or you're submitting your LOI, and at that point you need X number of signatures to demonstrate community engagement. And at times there is, of course, a lag between when you're submitting your LOI and then your interview. Leaders don't stop engaging with the community between those two checkpoints with the authorizer. And in many cases, none of that community engagement that happens actually is taken into account or actually accounted for in the scoring or the rubric or in the interview. So I think that really leaves a lot of voices on the table. It really just doesn't accurately reflect the amount of work and sort of momentum that may be behind this application or the desire for the school to open doors when it is just evaluated at that snapshot capture of signatures early on in the process. So one idea would be to continue in whatever way we can to have, till date ways for leaders to demonstrate how their community engagement efforts continue and have grown. And then the second is really, and I don't know that I have an answer here, but just the challenge of how do you include or encourage families who are wary of putting their names down on a piece of paper? And that is not the right way to actually demonstrate the voices of those families. So how do we actually create a way to capture that desire, need, and engagement in a way that does not feel threatening or scary to the families that our leaders are most looking to serve?
Yeah, I love that idea. I'd be curious if, and David, I saw your hand up, but I'd be curious to hear from some authorizers on the call, just on your thoughts about that.
It wasn't so much a thought about that, but it triggered a situation where kind of like we had a school who wanted to meet the specific needs of a population. The staff reflected the population currently, and they were going from being a school that was primarily a religious focused school. And then they wanted to then switch it to a charter school, and they had the paper with all the names and signatures and it, as they were, and ours is broken into phases. So as they were getting through the first phase, the office received all these phone calls from the family. So I'm not sure who signed what names were on this long list of names that, when we got the initial application, it appeared that, oh, okay, this is something their community is excited about. It's a way for them to maintain traditions and, what have you. And then it was just a barrage of calls showing that is not what their community wanted. And so I guess my question to that is, in trying to really see, what does the community actually want and to become engaged? What are some ways that you can go beyond the name with the, the sheet with the names where you can accurately find out, no, like real talk, what does the community, just the school community, if it's a current community, and then, we're just trying to figure out a better way to do that because that didn't feel great.
Thank you, Chantra. Actually, Chantra, I don't know where you're located. Do you mind just sharing what state you're in?
Oh, I am in Michigan, University Center, Michigan.
Nice, thank you. I think that's such a great question. I used to be an authorizer in Louisiana, and it wasn't uncommon for something very similar to happen, right? Like you get all these names on a sheet of paper, but then when the public meeting happens, you got a whole bunch of folks who show up who are opposed. And so, yeah, I would love to hear from Sonda, from Aasimah, but actually anyone else on the call, your thoughts on that, because I think that is key. Like who is the real community, and how are you as an authorizer supposed to kind of engage and gauge that?
Veronica, I just want to jump in, like add one more, spin on the parent engagement piece to the community question. Because last week at our discussion where we had a couple of authorizers and then we had the executive director of Opportunity 180, this question came up around, are we doing families a disservice by actually requiring them to sign their name on the interest paper? Because what we haven't paid attention to as authorizers is this sense, like we are getting families to sign up and to invest in our dream and our vision. And if the school does not make it through the authorization process, then have we let those families down? And how have we communicated that? And what are the other opportunities they have, and so on? So I think, Veronica, to the like definition of what is the community question, I think there's also an element of how do parents and families fit into not only the community, but how are we responding to their sort of needs and aspirations also, right? So there's sort of, I think they go hand in hand, but that, it was so eye-opening when they said that last week. And I can't believe after, right, all of these years of doing authorizing, like I hadn't thought of that question. So I think it's just really important to talk about here also.
Yeah, I think that adds a layer. Bridget, I see your hand up. Do you want to respond or add something else to this point?
Yeah, and I think this is very timely for us. We just had a public hearing, and I think in regards to community, this particular public hearing was in an area that does not have a charter school. So of course, the opposition was from the local school districts. But for us as the authorizer, rather than just, going back to the conversation about having the pieces of paper with the family names, we are always very cognizant of having the community support me, the local chamber of commerce, has the particular founder or school leader reached out to the superintendents in general? Have they made an effort to bridge a gap as they make their way into these particular school districts that don't have charter schools? I think that's important. And also, do they have backing from local industry or other community areas? That's not necessarily just family members, but if they have companies and industry that's going to support them, either through having employees that will be sending their kids there possibly, or also having events and they support them that way. I think that's crucial. At this particular public hearing, all opposition was from the local school districts, but all support were from actual local community members saying, we want school choice. And I apologize, I'm from the state of Indiana, from Indiana Charter School Board. So we're a statewide authorizer. And the one Chamber of Commerce individual said, it's very clear that our our state government wants school choice in Indiana. So it is up to us to acknowledge and kind of turn the corner and give parents what the governor and our legislators are asking for. So that was very important to us. And in addition, we make it very clear to everyone through our website and when they come onto the public hearing that equal weight, whether they speak or whether they email a comment, goes to our board. And I don't know if that's the same everywhere across all authorizers, but sometimes that makes it a lot more comfortable to someone to share their comment so they don't have to speak publicly, especially if their friends may be in opposition, but they may be for that particular charter school. So since we take everything to our board, we've found that we're starting to get a lot more comments through our email rather than an actual public hearing where we're taking minutes that way. So that's another area where we've gotten more community involvement.
Thanks, Bridget. Other folks, other thoughts?
Hi all. I'll jump in. This is David Greenberg at NACSA. And I'm thinking a little bit about like a couple things. Like for me, feel like community engagement, like that word engagement isn't quite the right thing that we're talking about here. I mean, I think we're talking about two things. I think one, as an authorizer, we want to make sure that there's going to be enough students and families who actually want to go to this school.
I think David might be having some computer issues. I don't want to speak for him, so when he comes back through, we will ask him again. But I think at least what the beginning part of his sentence or his thought triggered for me is like, it is interesting, right? Because NACSA, for example, has this new initiative that I think most of you are aware of about community responsive authorizing and community centered authorizing. And even though I think we're still trying to work through exactly what the definition of that is, because we don't want to quite define it for other people, because we think it looks different depending on community. I do think community-centered authorizing, community-responsive authorizing is different than community engagement. In the past, community engagement, again, you know, with this project that Jason and I have been working on, is kind of the bare minimum, right? If you look at state laws, it's things like, do you have a public meeting? Is there a public hearing? Do you require something in the application where the person has to talk about, you know, how they plan on working with the community? Does your board have to have community members or parents on it? Again, just like, it's kind of, it's still, in my mind, kind of the to communities instead of with communities piece. And so I think that's just really difficult. And David, it looks like you're back on. So I'd be curious to hear the rest of that thought.
Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, you're getting at where I was headed. Like, I think for authorizers, there's the concern about, are there going to be enough students and families who want to go to this school, right? That's sort of one bucket of things I think we have to care about, because if there's not enough students, the school's not viable, right? We don't want to invest all these resources in a school that kids don't want to go to. And then there's this question that I think we've been talking about, is like, is this school of the community? Is it by, for, and of the community? Is this like a community determining how it wants to educate its children? And I think that's what, and I'm not really good at plugging stuff for myself, but I'm going to have a blog here coming out through NACSA here in the coming weeks about an experience I recently had reviewing some applications in Minnesota, and one particularly that came from the Red Lake Nation in northern Minnesota. Like, this wasn't about community engagement. This was folks who live in this community, who have children, who have nephews and nieces, and who are educators and who are experts and all these kinds of things, coming together to start a school for their community. And that's like a different thing. And as authorizers, I mean, this particular instance was so obvious you couldn't miss it. But sometimes it's more complicated, like, because there is no one community typically, right? And so as authorizers, how do we actually get at, is this a school that is of community? Not just that has a bunch of signatures, or even one that we think will get good enrollment. How do we know if a school is of community? So I'd love to hear thoughts on that too.
I'll just quickly say, David, that's really the question that we are trying to answer through the co-design process that we have. And honestly, when we think about our incubation efforts, ideally, and the goal would be that this isn't a strand of the fellowship. This is just how we support leaders to design schools. And the biggest obstacle there at this point is funding, right? If you think about the fellowship, or at least the work that we do, to support a leader to have a full-time job, which is to design and create a school that's a year long, is now twice as expensive when you make that job 2 years long. And then you're again now 3 years out from opening doors and probably 5 or 6 years out from state results, depending on grade levels. So it's not even just a dollars issue. I think it is and now how long do you take to demonstrate proof of concept or success? And how do you now keep that cycle going? So I think it's an important question. And I think it also maybe encourages all of us to think outside of what has been normal or traditional, or I would argue even a little bit supremacist culturally, right? Like we're going to prioritize speed and we're going to prioritize results at the expense of truly engaging communities.
Thank you, Aasimah. I really appreciate that and you naming that. Aaron, I see your hand up.
If I could say something, this to me is really fascinating. You know, I'm from Nevada State Authorizer, and it makes me wonder, you know, we talk about essentially, you know, for the communities, and it makes me think of an idea of EMO versus CMO versus the private schools or the mom and pop, you know, the startups, and makes me wonder in our rubric, in our application, if you folks have separate questions, because when you talk about if it's essentially a custom built school for that community, that would seem to lend itself more for a mom and pop startup versus a CMO, EMO school that is coming in with canned programs. But of course, in the capacity interview, we'll ask them about that. And they've done their market study, these EMO, CMO, to say, oh, we found, you know, community members interested in this model, but still they're bringing in, many are bringing in canned programs. And I don't know if other authorizers have specific questions to try and make sure that, yes, it's a canned program, but it is one that will fit this community.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Mike. Let's let Aaron speak, and then let's come back to that because yeah, I do think it's an important one.
Sort of on the same note, and to what David raised, we, where I live, tend to do a lot of digging into the community when we go through the authorization process and really try to make sure that the schools that have applied are like part of the community, and they can really prove that they understand the community that they're trying to start their school in. What we run into though is we heavily rely on the state's application. That's kind of what we use to go through the process. And so even at our level as an authorizer, if we find that a school doesn't really fit the needs of the community and we have done all the digging and we don't authorize on our end, we run into the appeals process. And then the school will go up to the state level and appeal, and they usually get it. Like probably half the time they'll get it. And the reason for our denial of the application is based on some of those ideas around the community needs and a real awareness of the community that they're serving. And so I think I'm just kind of wondering, how do we work on that level when we have this appeals process that's always kind of looming over us, when we know the state is not necessarily going to know the specifics of what we've kind of looked into, and they see a school that is able to raise test scores, or they can do all of the academic things that we tend to look for. But that's not necessarily the reason why we have dug a little deeper into the application.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think that point does kind of align nicely with Mike's question, because at least, you know, again, just speaking from my own personal experience, in a state where you had both state authorizer, but then districts could also authorize, you know, it seems like, I think authorizers tend to be a little bit risk averse, right? Which is understandable because we're talking about kids' lives. And so we're looking for something that we're, you know, we want to be as sure as we can that it's going to work, that it's going to really benefit kids. And sometimes it's easier to go with the canned thing, you know, to use Mike's words, because at least there's you know, there's data or something else supporting that it works, versus going for the brand new folks, right? That takes a little bit more faith. And so, yeah, I think it does become difficult. And then to your point, Aaron, multiply that by, you know, whatever factor, when you have an appeals process where, you know, perhaps the appeals entity is definitely going to go with the with the more known operator. So I'm curious if there are any folks on the call who have experienced that, and if there's anything that you found to be helpful, right? You know, my mind automatically goes to, that's why it's so important to just have, to Sonda's earlier point, just a really clear and a really transparent process that says, this is exactly what we as an authorizer are looking for, and how we will be evaluating the operator, so that if it does go to appeals, you know, perhaps there's a little bit more room to say, well, this is how it didn't meet, you know, our standards. But I mean, right, that's much easier said than done. So curious what other people have experienced.
I think it could also be a question of like, what are we looking to have the demonstration of, right? That has been really defined for us in one way for so long. In terms of, Veronica, to your point, like, right, so how are we defining risk, right? We're defining risk in a set of measures that, right, looks pretty traditional, and how do we maybe reframe that? But I think we say that, and then we don't actually think about what the reframing is, right? And because I think none of us should say like that a CMO or an EMO is incapable of being with or of the community. I think we have to sort of push down that line too. You know, we're seeing some shifts, right? I think we could all fall on different sides of the fence about how successful those have been, but we have to put forward what those new expectations are also, in order to redefine and then have leaders and organizations meet that, right? And so I think that's another layer to the question of like, in order to still feel like we are assessing the risk, what is the risk that we want to try and determine? So, you know, flipping it on its head, how do we look at if a school is going to do damage to a community? How do we look at, you know, so there's both sides of it, right? What are they going to bring, and how are they contributing, and how are they of? And also, like, what would be the risks if they're not doing that well? And how do we start sort of digging in on those pieces? And I don't know those answers, but those are some of the things we're thinking through.
And there's probably more questions than there are answers right now, because I think a lot of folks are, you know, this is a shift. I think, you know, authorizing has looked one way for a really long time. And I think we're just starting to really get to a point where we are asking some of these more complex questions that will hopefully lead to new ideas and new answers, but doesn't necessarily mean that we have them right now. So I would just encourage us, perhaps, as we come across new things, new ideas, to just make sure that we're sharing those with one another. I'm really glad that we had Sonda and Aasimah with us today. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I spend enough time with the folks on that side, right, of the work, right, on the operator, on the funder, on the incubation side. And I think that having more conversations like these will hopefully help us as authorizers and those of us who are helping support you as authorizers figure out how to be more responsive and to do this work even better. So with that, if there are any other questions, happy to take them, but also happy to give you 20 more minutes back to your day. But before we go, I would just love to give a round of applause, silent or otherwise, to Sonda and Aasimah today. Thank you so much for being with us. All right. Well, that's all she wrote, guys. Be sure that you complete our poll. Should be up on your screen. And if you have any thoughts or questions, let us know. And as always, the recordings will be up on Authorize as well.
And Veronica,
Thanks, Veronica.
I just asked David to remind folks about next week. So
Yes, thank you, Amy. Next week, we're going to try to put some of this into action. And Crystal actually mentioned it earlier. We're going to have Crystal Starwich from the Washington State Charter School Commission and Aaron Anderson from Osprey Wilds, authorizer in Minnesota, share with you and seek to get some feedback from folks about some changes they're making to their process or to their application to try to get at some of these concepts of community, of the community embeddedness, anti-racism, equity. How do we, so really, we will ask you, again, this won't be a session where you can sit back and do nothing. You got to come, be ready to do some work, give some feedback to Crystal and Aaron, talk with your colleagues, hopefully get some ideas about what you might want to do with your application. So looking forward to seeing you all next week. And Aasimah and Sonda, you absolutely, please come if you can. I think, I know Crystal would love to hear more about what you're thinking, as would Aaron. So would love to have you.
Well, thanks for having us here in the first place. I think, Veronica, like you said, just having more opportunities to have these conversations is what's going to make the change and make, I don't know, the world a safer place again, maybe at some point. We'll see. But good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.